Rome was saying, I'm very keen on providing empirical support for Marx's theory. Most Marxist discussion is always about theory. What did Marx say? Or no, I think he said something different from what you say he said. He didn't mean that. And well, that's useful to some extent, but actually we want to know whether the basics of Marx's theory, the law of value, the law of profitability, have any empirical validity. I mean, does it help us to make forecasts, predictions? Would you believe I'm in favor of making predictions? That's a very frightening thing to say, because I never heard most Marxist academics, oh, you don't do that. You'll get it wrong. Well, yeah, maybe, but isn't that what science is about? Science is about having predictive power. It's not just, if a theory is correct, it must have some predictive power. Einstein's theory of relativity had predictive power, and they proved it when we looked at the eclipse of the sun, and they could see that the sun had bent light and so on. And that applies, as far as I'm concerned, to social science, or scientific socialism, as Engels called it. The scientific part of socialism seems to have disappeared quite a bit sometimes.
With that great exposition, thank you for that, Michael. I think we'll start now. Just before that, I guess I'll give a quick introduction. So welcome everyone. This session today will be about Marx's schema of reproduction that can be found at the end of Capital 2 and describe the sort of macro dynamics of capitalism, or at least in a model of capitalism. Our speaker today is Mr. Michael Roberts. He's worked in the City of London as a Marxist economist for a long time. He writes regularly in his blog, The Next Recession, which I urge all of you to read. It's quite fascinating. He's written a couple of influential books, in my opinion. The first one is, of course, The Long Depression, where he talks, I think he tries to explain through this theory of Kondratiev waves that basically what we saw in 2008 was just a start. We're sort of in a larger depression that we'll only get out of if there's another sort of another larger round of creative destruction. And of course, recently he wrote a book on the contribution of Engels to political economy. And with that, Michael, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me over there in Delhi and New York and wherever else you are for this discussion on your reading group in Volume 2. As I was telling Rowan before, if you missed it, I haven't looked at Volume 2 for some time. So this is a good opportunity to go back and reconsider, as Rowan says, the key parts of Volume 2, which you'll reach in the question of the reproduction schema, which in a way, in my view, by the word reproduction tells you what it's about. It's about the reproduction of capital, the accumulation of capital and reproducing, and how that circulates and reproduces within a capitalist economy, or at least a model capitalist economy, which he divides between the two ways in which capitalism operates, basically from the workers and from the point of view of the capitalists. So we have two sectors basically in Marx's reproduction schema, and then from that we get a view about the way in which capital accumulates and also grows, and that's very important. So I'm going to share a few graphs, as this is always my want, and as I expected, the host needs to enable me to show them, and then we'll be away.
Shyam, could you just
make me a host? Yep.
Yeah, you can share now.
Okay. Yep. Let me see if I can get the right one now. Where are we? Here we go.
Michael, you are
okay. I'm sorry. Let's start again. Okay, so Marx starts off with in Volume 2 in the chapters where he refers to what he calls simple reproduction, and he divides the reproduction of capital and the circulation of capital into two departments, and he makes certain assumptions when he starts that. He says that there is Department 1, which is the production, what you might call capital goods, investment goods that capitalists use to develop the means of production, and there's one department, and the other department is the production and sale of consumer goods that workers and capitalists consume in the process of accumulation and production. And he starts off with a scheme of simple reproduction, namely both departments grow at the same zero rate. There is no growth in these departments. So we're now looking at just the transfer of capital and value between the two departments. And he also assumes there's no technological growth. So while growth takes place in expanded reproduction, which we'll come to at the moment, and that can only occur, of course, if there is technological progress, or at least an expansion of the amount of capital going into the economy. But here we're talking about where there's no change in the amount of capital in the economy, and there's no change in technological progress. Also, it's closed, so we're not going to get into the issues of trade with other countries or the movement of capital flows. We're assuming one world capitalist economy with no national boundaries. And so there's no accumulation or disaccumulation of stocks. There's no spare on the outside before we start, no additional means of production that we can, or money or loans that we can pull out or obtain from warehouses and storerooms to do this. So we're starting at a very bare bones understanding of the process of reproduction here. And so we can only get this production through, first of all, the development of, let's get this moving. Okay, so on the simple reproduction, we have two departments. And as we can see, the example I'm using here, which is Marx's, we've got a department 1, which has capital, constant capital of 250, variable capital, how much it's spending on the workers, of 100, and we're assuming a surplus value created by the workers of 150. That gives us 500 in department 1, which is the capital goods sector. In department 2, the same amount of constant capital is available, the same amount of spending on workers and the workforce, and the same surplus value, exactly the same size. So we get a total of 500 constant capital, 200 variable capital, 300 surplus capital, the surplus value, and a total of 1,000 for the total production of the economy. And the point that Marx is making here is that in this situation, the constant capital is available to the capitalists in the producing in the constant capital sector or the capital goods sector. So there's no need to make any transfers there. But if the capitalists in the consumer goods sector require capital, they have to get it by a transfer of this value coming over here from the department 1 to the departments to constant capital. So the fundamental formula of simple reproduction here is that constant capital in department 2, which is the consumer goods capital, will be equal to the new value created in the capital goods sector. Because this is the point. This capital is not just value, it's use values, and they're actually capital goods. That's a very important point that Marx is making here. It's not just the value in exchange value terms, but it's in use value terms, it's capital goods. And those capital goods end up being used in the consumer goods sector as their capital to carry out the reproduction and the consumer goods. And that's the balance. If this system of simple reproduction, assuming no changes, and we've discussed before, provides you with that balance. There's no assumption, of course, that balance will be achieved, but that is the model of simple reproduction. So that the capital produced in department 1 is used by, and that's the new value, apart from one they keep for themselves, the capital goods, V and S there, 250, end up as 250 as the capital goods in the production of consumer goods by the capitalists in the consumer goods. So that's the basic position of simple reproduction. If we can do it, we can start playing around with how that moves around. If you want, it's a bit of a complicated graph. I won't really go through it very well, but if you want to study it afterwards when I send you the slides, pinch from somebody else, then you can see how the movement of the various bits of the two departments end up going across from workers and from capitalists. Extended reproduction, however, is now starting the process of growth. We're now assuming that this model capitalist economy is going to get bigger. is going to get bigger in the total amount of value that's being produced. And newly produced means of production that Department 2 would have to be obtained in order to, this is the key point that Marx makes. It's not very clear, I think, in these two chapters, but I think that is the key point, that in order to grow, and assuming we don't have any extra money from anywhere else or any extra capital from anywhere else, and we're in a closed economy, the only way we can grow means that we have to invest more, and that means more going into Department 1. So they need additional, they will have to produce additional means of production. The only way they can do that, of course, is to reduce the amount going into Department 2 in consumption goods. So this economy is making a decision. Who makes a decision, of course, is capitalists. In a capitalist economy, in a non-capitalist economy, it might be a different set of decisions based on a different set of incentives, but the decision is made to reduce the amount that goes to Department 2 in order to give more to Department 1, so that a process of expansion of reproduction begins, because in order to reproduce and expand under capitalism, and really under virtually any economy, it is necessary for a Department 1 to grow relative to Department 2. There must be more investment in capital goods, and that means in the workers producing capital goods, so that the investment begins the process of building up growth across the board. So later on, Department 2 can also grow. But to start off, if the two departments grow at the same rate, as they would eventually do, in Marx's examples they do, but the relationship will remain unchanged, there will be an imbalance between Department 1 and Department 2. So when you read these chapters, you will see that as in expanded production, Department 1 is going to be bigger than Department 2. And that's an indication of how this process of expanded reproduction goes on. Marx gets them to balance, but there's no necessary reason why they should balance. So the transition to extended reproduction, here's our simple reproduction figures again, exactly the same, no change. In year 2, we now see that whereas in order to get some growth, the constant capital in Department 1 has now been increased by 50, from 250 to 300, and the capital available to Department 2 has been reduced accordingly from 250 to 200. The same ratios then apply to new value against that. No change in the ratios, but that change of ratios, of course, changes the actual process of production. So now we get an increase in the simple reduction was 500 and 500. Now Department 1 has 600 in total value produced, and Department 2, the consumption goods sector, has been reduced accordingly to 400 as a result of this change, this decision to reduce the amount of capital going into the consumer goods sector in expanded reproduction. Now in the third year, we can see a general increase in the production of capital, which we now have 600 here instead of 500. So we can add 60 to this, the ratio not really changing, and 40 to here because we've got an extra 100, and then the ratios run through. So the result is an increase in the value of total production. So we've gone from 1,000, no change here, just the change in the ratio that's going from Department 1 compared to Department 2 in constant capital. But this produces, in the end, an increase in the total amount of production. And you can see that at least up to year 3, the consumer goods sector is still smaller in value terms than it was when it started. It's only 480. The capital goods sector is way higher. And you can see the imbalance now between Department 1 and Department 2 in total value is quite considerable. So here we have extended reproduction taking place by a decision of reducing the consumer goods sector's capital and shifting it into capital goods. That produces the growth in the economy overall, but it means that the investment goods or capital goods sector is bigger than the consumer goods sector. That process can begin to be changed as you go into year 4 and year 5, but here's the example, at least after 3 years. So simple reproduction requires a balance and equality between the new value generated in Department 1, that which is capital goods, V1 and S1, and Department 2's demand for that constant capital, which is C2. So if Department 2 needs some constant capital, it gets it from Department 1's new value production in simple reproduction, and the balance is there. Under expanded reproduction, however, it requires that the new value in Department 1 exceed Department 2's demand for constant capital. So Department 2 has less demand for constant capital, and Department 1 gets more of that constant capital, keeps more of it. So relatively more of the output of Department 1 is used and less by Department 2 than under simple reproduction. And as one commentator said, the change destination is nothing more than a disproportionate growth of constant capital, which is a key feature of capitalist accumulation. That is, the point is that constant capital will increase more than variable capital. We call that the tendency for the rising organic composition of capital over the process of capital growth and accumulation. So in a way, the move towards expanded reproduction represents a model of the takeoff of growth of the capitalist economy, because capitalist economies are not sitting still and just simply reproducing as in the simple reproduction model. They're in a process of expanded reproduction. And that process of expanded reproduction means that Department 1 will exceed Department 2 over a period of time in its value. And so you could say that the takeoff of capitalism in Britain, Japan, Russia, and so on, through the industrial revolutions, fit into this pattern of an increasing amount of constant capital relative to an increasing amount of variable capital, or if you like, an increasing amount of capital in the capital goods sector in value production compared to the consumer goods sector. So, of course, the benefits of this increase, which leads to rising productivity, don't go to the people who, through increased consumption, like peasants and wage earners, but they go into the profits, and the proceeds are used for further capital formation by the capitalists. That might be different in a different post-capitalist economy, where you will make a redistribution of the benefits, but under capitalism, the money is appropriated, the new extra value is appropriated in the form of profits, and capitalists can use that to expand production. So more and more labor is taken into wage employment, but wages aren't allowed to rise as fast as productivity. Otherwise, the gains from this growth would not be in the hands of the capitalist class. So this process of extended reproduction is what you might call accumulation for accumulation's sake. As the phrase goes from Marx, accumulate, accumulate, that's Moses and the prophets. That's the commandment of capitalism. It's accumulation is now not taking place for consumption, it's taking place for accumulation of more capital. Therefore, production is for the sake of production almost. This is the formula which classical economists considered was necessary. You're not there to spend and consume, you're there to save and invest and build up yet more capital. Thus, the capitalist economy increasingly becomes a system of production for production's sake. As Marx said, it will never do, therefore, this is very important, to represent capitalist production as something which it is not. It's not production having for its immediate purpose the consumption of goods or the production of means of enjoyment even for capitalists, even if they have their yachts and all the rest of it. That's not the purpose of capitalist production. It would overlook the specific character of capitalist production, which is production for accumulation of yet more accumulation of production and so on. This is an unending process, capitalism would hope, in the model that we've outlined. Now, that has led to a bit of a discussion amongst the various Marxists who've looked at the reproduction schema. They've thought to themselves, well, I cite three here, Hilferding, Bauer, and Kautsky in the late 19th century. They take the balanced, simple reproduction schema that you saw, and even the extended reproduction schema, by the way that Marx has described it, suggest that you can have permanent, undisturbed accumulation, production for production's sake, capital accumulation for accumulation's sake and onwards, and it would have no effect on the capitalist economy, and there will be no crisis. And that the law of the falling rate of profit, which doesn't appear in the schema, it only comes in volume 3, would be completely superseded because there's undisturbed accumulation. And the reproduction schema, according to them, prove that capitalism can go on indefinitely. So if there are any crises, they must just be due to temporary disproportionalities, which could be avoided if you just had a bit of conscious planning to ensure that the production goods sector and the consumer goods sector operates on a reasonably balanced basis. And if we get those proportions right, said Helferding, then capitalism can expand indefinitely. Luxemburg was angrily opposed this view, and she says, actually, in volume 2, the reproduction schema proved that capitalism doesn't work, that it's going to go into crisis, because there is a chronic imbalance of investment over consumption. And Marx didn't recognize how serious this was as a fault in capitalism, because there's nothing in volume 2 from Marx to suggest that this implies the major cause of crises under capitalism. Marx didn't recognize this. He should have done, because this is key, according to Luxemburg, to explain why there is a crisis in capitalism, namely this imbalance between the growth of the investment goods sector over the consumption goods sector. But as Marx says elsewhere, and other people have said similarly, demand and supply never coincide, it's only by chance. So the idea that it's necessary for things to be totally imbalanced for capitalism to work is a dangerous position to take, because it would imply that if there is an imbalance, capitalism can never work. It's not a question of occasionally being out of line, because investment goods sector is always, as I'll show shortly, much larger than the consumption goods sector and grows much larger, in which case how can capitalism work at all if Luxemburg is to interpret the reproduction scheme as she does? As Marx says, there would be no capitalist production at all if we had to if it had to develop simultaneously and evenly in all spheres as the only way it could work. And the other argument often used is that this shows that there's a chronic lack of demand in the capitalist process of accumulation, because if production is just for production's sake and not for consumption, then we'll have a realization problem, as it's called. Workers will, capitalists won't be able to sell all these goods because they're just doing means of production, and it's going to outstrip the production of articles of consumption. But as Lenin said, demonstrated clearly in his schemes, the production of the means of production can and must outstrip the production of the articles of consumption. That's the whole point of the extended production model. The quicker growth of Department 1 as against Department 2 is beyond dispute, says Luxemburg. And she correctly says is the foundation also of Marx's fundamental law that the rate of profit tends to fall. By that she means that if the capital goods sector is expanding faster than the wage goods sector, in other words, that's a reflection of the rise in the organic composition of capital, a faster growth in constant capital relative to variable capital across all sectors. And that, of course, is the fundamental tendency law behind the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Of course, as you may know, Luxemburg considered this rate of profit law to be rather irrelevant to crises, a very long-term idea. She said, the rate of profit can't play any role in crises. If it did, we'd have to wait for the sun to burn out first before the rate of profit would play a role in crises. For her, the crises come about because Department 1 is growing faster than Department 2, and this creates a chronic secular shortfall in effective demands. As that was Luxemburg's argument, also the argument that she presented to say why there was imperialism, because therefore capitalists had to look outside of this closed economy to sectors of the world where there were still new people coming, non-workers coming into the sphere of capitalism to provide the demand that was missing because of this chronic shortage of demand for consumer goods. But as the extended reproduction scheme, we do not conclude from that. What we conclude from that is that investment demand can grow more than consumer demand. That doesn't mean that supply and demand in each department is not in balance. That could happen by chance anyway, but there is no reason to assume that that would bring about a collapse of capitalism just because the investment sector grows faster than the consumer sector. And in fact, if we look at the empirical evidence, that's exactly what it is. If we look here, here's the situation of the US, a graph on the right-hand side. You can see the investment growth that's private fixed capital in the US since 1933, and the real personal consumption growth, one of the dotted lines underneath that big long line, since 1933 and real GDP. And clearly, the investment sector grows way faster than the consumption sector. So the extended reproduction schema that Marx outlines is reproduced empirically in the US. Investment demand is 72 times larger than it was in 1933 by 2008, but it was consumption demand was only just over 50 times larger. But capitalism didn't collapse all the way through the period. We had crises at various points, but clearly they can't be related to just this general trend for investment to outstrip consumption. Otherwise, capitalism would be in permanent crisis, and it's not in permanent crisis. As Marx said, there is no permanent crisis. There's a series of booms and stumps and crises in capitalism, which clearly can't relate, if the reproduction schema that I've suggested to you is correct, to the question of one sector outgrowing the other sector. So these schemes do not give rise to the argument that they are the cause of crises, the imbalance. But the simple reason is that when we're looking at the real causes of crises, we have to look elsewhere at the rising organic composition of capital, its relation to the increases in productivity, and the law of profitability, or tendency of the rate of profit to fall, as the understanding basis for crises, which only appears in volume 3. So here we have schemas which are really trying to explain how the different two big sectors of the economy in this model operate in order to produce both the reproduction of capital as it was, but also an extended process, and that Marx saw this process inevitably as one in which there is unevenness between the two sectors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it would cause a slump in the world economy or the collapse in the world capitalist economy. So that's as far as I've got here, really. I shall just get out of this. Where are we? That's how I see it. Now I'm expecting you guys to tell me how wrong I am.
No, I think certainly someone has some ideas about that. I can go ahead. But thank you for that, Michael. I think firstly, some of the questions I had, you did address. But let's start taking questions from someone else now. So does anyone want to go? Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. So Keynes has, like Keynesians usually say that when in a crisis, you address the demand problem. And then that's how, I guess that's how they see it, the imbalance that you were talking about, but that's what led to the crisis. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's a very basic question of difference between the view of Marxist economics and Keynesian economics and post-Keynesian economics, which is a variant of that. Their view is that, first of all, Keynesian economics, mainstream economics and Keynesian economics do not discuss the question of profit. Profit is either a residual that comes out of capitalist investing, or it doesn't exist at all. And certainly profit from the exploitation of labor power is not a conception that Keynesians and post-Keynesians accept. So if they have a view that, as you know from their macro models, that basically there's only two ways of looking at it. There's you either invest or consume, or you either invest or save, and in order to investment will equal savings, and most important from the Keynesian point of view is investment drives savings and therefore drives consumption. It's not profit driving investment, which is what the Marxist theory is. So I was reading it the other day. The usual story is we give them the macro model, and at the end of it they say, well, basically investment equals savings, investment drives savings. Or Mikhail Kalecki, a Marxist Keynesian, if you like, puts it this way, and I always get this right. Capitalists earn what they invest, and workers, which way does he put it? It's basically, Kalecki says the profits come from investment. But a Marxist would say, well, yes, I know when capitalists invest, they may or may not get profits out of this because they exploit the labor force to get those profits, and they may be more than the investment. The profit rate may go up or down, but profits come from investment? So he's really saying that profits come from capitalists investing in machinery and raw materials and labor, but there's no distinction, and that the result of their investment is profit. So it's good old capitalists are able to produce their own profit. The other way round of looking at it is, no, investment comes from profits. And I could put it this way to you, that if there was profits, does that necessarily mean there will be investment? No, capitalists can sometimes hoard money. They don't use their profits to invest. And in the simple reproduction scheme we've just seen, they wouldn't invest more, you could say. They could just maintain the situation as it was because they don't want to expand production. So in that sense, surely profits become before investment and not the other way around, which is what the Keynesians would like to say. Aditi's theory can be even more crude. It's even more crude with some Keynesians who don't even refer to investment demand. Their view is that demand is really consumer demand. So that the reason we have crises is that the workers don't get enough wages, or there's not enough government spending, and therefore consumer demand is too weak. We have chronic lack of consumer demand, and this produces crises. Well, if that was the case, then how can we explain empirically the fact that if we look at the last 6 recessions in the US, 1 year before each recession, what is the thing that collapses? Is it consumption? No. It's in business investment. Business investment is what collapses 1 year before each crisis. I looked at the last 6. There's only 1 year where consumption, personal consumption in the US falls a little before the slump comes a year later. And the fall in consumption in the slump, when you get to the slump, is still way less than investment. So clearly investment is the driving force in capitalism for booms and slumps. So what drives investment? Well, you can't turn the circuit around the other way as the Keynesians do and say, well, investment drives profits. Well, wait a moment. We're talking, why is investment down there? And then we look at the question of profitability and profits, and we find, not just theoretically, as I explained, argued now, but empirically, if we look at the rate of profitability and the mass of profits, beforehand, we can see very good causal connections, not just from Marxist empirical work, but from mainstream empirical work, to show that when profits fall slow or even go into a reverse, then pretty much within a year or so, you get fall in business investment. When you get fall in business investment, you then get a fall in employment and GDP and consumption. Well, yes, consumption goes down when workers are unemployed, but unless they're in the COVID when they get funded. But we have that is the order. The difference between Marxist and Keynesian economics is the Marxist one is from profit to investment to employment to income to consumption. The Keynesian one is consumption to income to employment to investment to profits. Now, all right, you can have it if you want to do your macro identity in your university college macro identities, they're exactly the same macro identity. But which is the causal direction? That is the question that has to be answered. The Keynesians will say profits is a residual, which always seems to me a ludicrous argument to make, given that we're the sort of economy that we're operating under. Long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
Just give me a second, Nimish. I think if I may add a very crude addendum to Michael's answer. I think this year the Indian economy has shrunk by what 7.5 to 8%. As many surveys show, wages have reduced, unemployment has not really recovered, and so by all accounts, demand has been low. And yet, for some of the larger companies, this has been a year of record profits, and that's that to me, I think that's perhaps in a cruder sense, but a very clear indication of the fact that it's not demand that has driven this growth. It is clearly profitability, where they were able to reduce wages significantly enough to make up for the increased costs. And I believe in India there weren't even increased costs, so they actually had costs falling as well. So I think it's clear that the Keynesians are obviously very wrong here. Before that, sorry, after that, yeah, please, Nimisha, you had a question.
Hello. Yeah, hi. So I have this question. Since, like you said, that it's actually productions for production's sake. So is it safe to say that now that the large corporations are, investing a lot in technology, in artificial intelligence, in robotic process automation, and they are actually trying to make most of the work, like, make these machines, artificial intelligence, do most of the works for them, because that is again a capital, that will be a capitalistic asset. So are we actually headed to, is this a sign that we are headed towards a very big crisis in future when everything gets automated and there is this large section of masses and laborers and workers who are left unemployed and without any capital in their hand, any means of production in their hand, and there's going to be like this massive gap which will be created with 1 or 2% people holding most of the capital of the world, with 80%, 90% people struggling for a living. So is that is that where we are headed? I mean, I really wanted to ask this question when you're explaining this production for production's sake.
It's a big question, and in some ways we're already there where your fear, in a way, we're already there. We've seen a massive increase in the concentration of capital into smaller and smaller groups of companies, the centralization of that through finance as well. And this has been a process that's obviously taken decades and more than decades to build up, so that we see a whole increase through the investment more and more in means of production relative to labor, which is a fundamental tendency of capitalism. Because why? Well, the aim of capitalism is to get profit, is to boost the profitability, to accumulate more capital. When we use the word capital, I mean the incorporation of profit value into commodities and means of production which the capitalists own. So it's accumulating the private appropriation of the value created by workers. This is the process of capitalism. And because capitalists are competing against each other, they're forced to this process of continually trying to accumulate more capital, Moses and the prophets. The most effective way for them to accumulate more capital is to boost the productivity of labor. So if one capitalist can boost its productivity of its labor force better than another capitalist, it can get more profit and a bigger share of the total profit being produced by all the capitalists in the economy. So there's a continual drive to lower labor costs and to boost the productivity of labor. And the best way to do that, yes, you can make workers 24 hours a day until they drop dead, or you can bring children in and women, and you can do all kinds of other things to extend the working day, or the size of the labor force, or the exploitation of the labor force directly. But the fundamental thing about capitalism is, in the last 150 years, has been that they've operated on the basis of expanding the technical base of the productive process through machines. And that, Marx said, and Engels said, this is a dramatically increased the productivity of labor. No other system and mode of production have done it so well. But of course, it's not for the benefit of society as a whole to reduce our working time, to provide us with the goods and social needs that we require. It's to accumulate this capital in the hands of the private owners of that capital. So the competition for more technology and the increase in technology is incessant. Capitalism has to introduce more technology. And the current position is, of course, that it has the opportunity to bring in new technology that we've not seen before, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's all the measures of robots that the sharp expansion here. This has two consequences. It's not always clear. It's not always clear which way it's going to go. First consequence is that inevitably that must mean the loss of jobs for whole layers of people across the world who are in industries where they can be replaced by robots or artificial intelligence. There's several estimates by mainstream economists that say up to 35 to 50% of occupations as we know them at the moment will disappear and be replaced by robots or artificial intelligence over the next few decades. So that implies huge technological unemployment. On the other hand, the creation of more technology in these areas means that there will be new employment in those sectors as well. So it's a balance between the two. Yes, technological employment for the old industries or the areas where robots can replace, but more employment in the areas where these robots have to be monitored, developed, or expanded across the world. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll end up with a position of virtually everybody being unemployed and robots running around. And if the second contradiction that arises from that also is that, as you will read in volume 3, is that the expansion of the organic composition of capital, the expansion of technology investment in that relative to labor power, eventually means that the tendency for profitability of the whole capitalist system to fall. Why? Because if Marx's theory of value is correct, only value is created by labor power, not by machines. Machines create things, but they don't create value which can be incorporated as profit, and only labor does that. So if labor is relatively producing less value, it's costing less, but it's producing less value as a result because less labor is being used relative to the amount that's being invested in technology, then there is a tendency for the profitability to fall. That is can be curbed, checked for all kinds of reasons, as you can read in volume 3, but that is the overall tendency. So to end on this point, Nuisha, the main, when we get to the end of the process, can we imagine a situation where basically everything is being produced by robots and labor is not involved? What does that tell you? Well, first of all, as we move to that, that must mean a dramatic fall in the profitability of capital, because most of it is going into constant capital relative to variable capital. And if only variable capital is the only one that produces value, then there's going to be a tremendous fall in profitability of capital. So even before we get to the position where robots run everything and we don't have any role in production at all, we would have massive crises in the capitalist system. Because what that tells you is that a system that's run, an economy that's where robots produce robots with AI to produce all the things we need, and human labor plays no role, is not a capitalist system anymore. It's a system maybe more like a slave system, because if the robots are all owned by 200 people around the world and the rest of us don't go to work anymore, then the 200 people in the world have either got a revolution on their hands, or they're going to have to subsidize the 7.9 billion people who haven't got any means of living. So this hypothetical, what can you call it? You can either dystopia, of course, doesn't exist, and it may not ever exist. We may never get to that point. But if you think of it hypothetically, what that tells you is, Marx economics tells you is that a robot economy is not a capitalist economy, because there's no value being created by labor power. It's a different economy. And before we ever get to that, we would have such a crisis under capitalism that it would create the conditions for a change in the economy anyway.
So just one more point, like, so do you think that this hyper, aggressive market which is existing around creating AI and everything, do you think that this is going to actually bring some real, like, very different economy, or a very different, it is going to transition into a very, very different kind of economy that we'll see in your future?
Well, we're certainly transitioning into a different sort of economy technologically. The economy is going to be increasing, capitalist economy worldwide is increasingly going to be into areas of new machinery, we might call it that, rather than machinery for heavy industry and all the other things that we've seen in the past, although that's still a big sector. And it also means that it doesn't mean the disappearance of the proletariat in the world, quite the contrary. If we look at the number of working class people in the world, people have to work for a living in industry, let alone outside of industry. This has never been larger. The proletariat is the largest it's ever been in the history of capitalism, which makes it this dangerous force if it ever united against the owners of capital. But we will have a different sort of economy, a much more information-based economy, technologically communications-based economy, clearly from what is developing. And then don't forget, it's not just this area. We've got genetics, we've got kinds of other things developing. But all this this is always changing, isn't it? Capitalism drives forward for more profit. it produces as a result some scientific progress. Not as well as it could be, because if we had a planned economy, we'd do it a hell of a sight better and more efficiently. And also it produces things we don't need, like more bombs, more nuclear missiles, more waste, more activities, unproductive activities that waste laboured value and time. So there's a continual grotesque distortion in this process. So the new economy of the next 3 decades, after I've gone and you can visit my grave, is going to be one that will be different in some senses than we've had up to now in terms of the sort of technology, but it's still the same system. It still operates in the same way with the same contradictions.
Thank you very much for the answer. Like, I was really looking for these answers. So thank you very much for this explanation that you just gave.
Guys, just to sort of keep this administratively okay, just try and sort of limit yourselves to one question. I understand. And yeah, anyway, Surit, please go next.
Okay, first up, Professor, thanks so much for coming here and like speaking to us about the reproduction schema. We really appreciate it. Like when we started this reading circle about a year and a half ago, we would have never imagined that, like Rowan, me, Aditi and all would never have imagined that we'd be able to speak with you or, you know, invite.
Well, you're very, all I can say is the group, as I said to Rowan, is very brave to be working through volume 2 of Capital. I would imagine that this group is one of the unique features of the world at the moment. You often hear of groups reading volume 1 or even sometimes volume 3, not enough, but I've never heard of anybody working through volume 2. Brilliant.
Okay, so Professor, my question actually had to do with a little bit of something you mentioned, which was Rosa's theory of imperialism.
Yeah.
And I understand you're also working on imperialism at the moment.
Yeah.
So recently I've been studying Uttar Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik's work on imperialism, and they present a pretty interesting theory of imperialism, which is necessary for all periods of capitalism. And I was just wondering if you could try and help me understand just like how the reproduction schema. I understand that the reproduction schema is for a closed economy, but if we put it into the context of imperialism, then how would the reproduction schema exactly function?
Yeah, well, you guys may have to help me when you've read the volume 2 on this, because I'm not sure that the reproduction schema are going to help us very far with understanding the process of imperialism. For me, the economics of imperialism, there's lots of political aspects of imperialism, aren't there? Colonial oppression, all the kinds of brutality and robbery that's gone around the world of the imperialist organizations and their military power and so on. But the economics of imperialism relies primarily on transferring a section of surplus value out of the global south, as we call it now, or the peripheral countries, into the imperialist economies through their multinational organizations and their banks and so on. And they're able to do this because they have a technological advantage, a better productivity level than the peripheral countries. And the multinationals are able to squeeze, in the process of trade and capital flows, a section of the surplus value that exists in the global south. That doesn't mean to say the global south capitalists aren't exploiting the workers. They are. This is an important point I'd like to make. A lot of people who are anti-imperialists say it's all the fault of the big multinationals of the global north that the people are poor in the south. No, 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 no. There's plenty of capitalists in the global south who are exploiting their workers. What's happening here with the process of imperialism through trade and capital flows is a section of the profits that those domestic capitalists are making in India and other places, a section of it end up in the global north because of their imperialist position, partly through, they might be able to do it through control of the trade with barriers and so on, but primarily because they have a better level of productivity and technological level. And so when prices are fixed on international markets, then a greater share ends up in the hands of the global north multinationals against the global south capitalists. All of that extra profit, of course, is being made out of the global south workers. And that second point that comes out of that, it's very important in what we've studied, is that means it's not the fault of the global north workers that the global south workers are poor, because it is a decision being made by the capitalists. They're the global north capitalists and the global south capitalists are exploiting the global south workers. And the global north workers, yes, they might get a handout from their own capitalists because the capitalists have got a bit more profit in terms of various things, but they're not part of the exploitive process here. That's very important because, again, some anti-imperialists say that the workers of the north are all really incorporated into the imperialist nexus and are incapable of changing the world, and they're really a big part of imperialism. Those arguments have been mentioned before, and I think the economics of imperialism, which we work in, shows that not to be the case. There's one other thing we learned from our work in imperialism, is that the imperialist countries are still the same countries. They were the same countries as 100 years ago. They've not changed. There's not been any newcomers, really, to the imperialist bloc. We've just had a G7 meeting in England, in Cornwall, and the G7 was there. It's the same G7 that was there 100 years ago. And of course, the two, they invited a few other friendly countries, Australia, India, South Korea, Taiwan. But South Korea and Taiwan, you can call them imperialist countries, they're tiny, tiny countries. And even they're much, I wouldn't classify them as imperialists because they're not really taking much extraction from the rest of the periphery. And India is not an imperialist country. It's a country that is exploited by imperialism. The Indian capitalists exploit their workers, and they have to give some of that money to the imperialists as a result of their world trade and so on. So there's no change in imperialism, period. And what that tells me is the idea that India, Brazil, or even China, for that matter, are going to become imperialist powers in the next 20 years in the image of the G7. Forget it. That's not going to happen. There's no process I can see economically where that is being achieved. And so the question that is raised by Surit is not the reproduction scheme, but tell you about the movement of capital flows between the consumer goods sector and the capital goods sector in a closed economy, both simple reproduction and extended. But they don't tell you the process of movement of value and extraction of value in the imperialist trading and investment process. That requires to look at the movements of the rate of profit in these different countries, not the movement in the two sectors of the simple reproduction or reproduction schema, the movement of the rate of profit and the level of technological superiority that countries have over others. And if you want to know the best model for imperialism, when you get to volume 3, there is the transformation process between values and prices of production in Marx. And he explains how the different sectors reach a price of production, which means that certain amounts of surplus value from those who are less efficient get transferred to those who are more efficient. They get an extra share of surplus value because there's a price of production set in the market. When you read that sector, that is the model for imperialism, in my view. You can apply that model not just as a model, but also to the imperialist situation.
Shyam.
Michael, I have a question. Actually, it's two questions. Just to link the question. The first one is basically you have shown US as an example how this reproduction schema was, where you have a department, the investment as well as the private consumption. We take US as a very perfect example for capitalism. Now, is there in any countries where this wasn't such a case, or any country where there was like a country like India, which is not even perfectly capitalist or kind of a semi-feudal type of arrangement, some kind of, and mostly an agrarian was there in the starting days. So was there any country where this wasn't observed in the sense? That is a question one. And question two, how the communist countries, Soviet, the erstwhile Soviet, USSR, how it was there the department 1 and department 2s were existed. What kind of relationship was there?
Yeah, very good second question. I'm not sure I can answer either of them, but the first one, are there any other countries that don't have the model that or the empirical evidence I showed on the US of a much bigger investment growth than consumer growth? I don't know. I don't think that if we look at the G7, I feel pretty confident that the US evidence will be repeated in the G7 across the board. Maybe we need to do that. That's the sort of empirical work I like to do, to see that we can confirm whether this has validity across the board. When it comes to India, well, all I would say is I think India is a capitalist economy. Obviously, it still has semi-feudal aspects to it, and a lot of the agrarian population you might consider are not agricultural laborers yet, so they're not really completely divorced from the land and forced to become just workers for labor power, but increasingly it's so, is it not? And that just as Russia in 1890s would say, oh, but when the Marxists said there, well, a lot of Marxists said, well, Russia isn't a capitalist economy, it's, you know, it's semi-feudal, most of the people are still serfs, really, they're still on the land. But you could say India is similar. But what the Marxists said at the time when they discussed this, and then in particular, said, no, Russia is a capitalist economy, increasingly a capitalist economy. Yes, it hasn't got much of a working class, but increasingly capitalism is forcing its way into the process, driving the peasants from their land or their small holdings to become rural laborers, or into the cities to become workers. And that was the experience of the Industrial Revolution in the G7 as well. So the same process is there. And what do we find in the cities? More machines. We find the expansion of the capital goods sector to come in and make workers work on the machines and not on the land anymore, towing a hoe and using highly labor-intensive operations. And the big multinationals move into the land and apply their fertilizers, their bigger companies, and that's the process of capitalism for the last 150 years. And as far as I can see, there is no difference in that sense from what is taking place in India, except the only difference is India is not going to become a G7 economy. It's not going to be allowed to. It's not going to get to that point. Now, your second question, remind me, Shema, because I got off, was what was your second question?
Yeah, I was just asking how the communist countries are in the
Soviet Union. Yeah, well, the Soviet Union, very good question, because the Soviet Union looked at the Soviet economists considered the reproduction schema as a very useful way of trying to do a planned economy. And so they saw the aim correctly in one sense, that the need to grow means you had to develop the capital goods sector relative to the consumer goods sector. It's, as Marx says, I think in volume 2, you'll tell me, correct me otherwise, he said this schema in a way applies to all societies. You have to take the surplus and you make a decision about whether you're going to grow or not. And that if you're going to grow, whether you're a capitalist economy or a planned economy, or you need to invest more in the ability to expand the productivity of labor, and that means investment into machinery and technology to boost the productivity of labor. Otherwise, you'll basically stay at the simple reproduction process schema. So the Soviet economists recognize that. So then I think the question is not so much the reproduction schema, but how could they implement that in the Soviet Union? They did go for heavy goods production and planning, but of course they weren't in a position also to develop the economy as a whole on the basis of a planned economy for all the reasons we know, the isolation of the economy, the weakness of the working class in the economy, a tiny sector of the population, the fact that consumption goods were so reduced that it was a disastrous situation for many periods. And I would have to say, in my view, the completely grotesque and disastrous policies of the Russian leadership, which led to famine and disaster and near defeat in the Second World War, and all kinds of other things which led not to the, as you might call, the possibility of a harmonious expansion of the schema through planning, but through a completely disordered disaster, which eventually has collapsed. Now, we could have a completely different discussion on why the Soviet Union collapsed, why China has not collapsed yet. Is China capitalist or is it socialist? You can get my answers on my blog from my point of view. And that is a whole big question. But the schema still gives you an idea that that's the process of a takeoff that an economy needs, is to go to develop the department one. Developing department two is much more difficult, isn't it? Because it will take some time to raise the level of incomes for people. And then how much, this is the question, I'll finish on this, it's very important. First, the consumer goods sector is not just a bunch of consumer goods like your clothes, like your cars, like all those individual consumer items that you think the consumer goods sector. No, under a socialist or a planned economy, the consumer goods sector are services, things like health, education, transport, communication. These are not heavy goods. These are not capital goods. These are things that the consumer goods sector produces for people. And that public goods, if you like, or services, is what a planned economy would do in expanding consumer goods. We worry less about whether you've got 6 different types of Ford or 5 different types of sofa. Maybe down the road we should get the most important thing is to deliver the basic social needs of the population in terms of health, education. I was just reading the Communist Manifesto again. I recommend it. If you go to the part where Engels talks about the immediate program, he says, once we've got public ownership, once we've got control of the means of production, the first thing we must do is provide free health, free education, free communication. You've heard the word communication. Somebody thought, well, yes, give me Amazon, give me these big companies. They should, why are they making all the profits out of communication? They should be public companies. It's ludicrous that we don't allow that development to take place in the benefit of the people. Now that is an expansion of the consumer goods department, which will be absolutely part of the process.
Shadan, you're muted.
Hi, Michael. I have one question that you mentioned about decreasing rate of profit in your presentation. So I have also come across like a few of these graphs which has shown that there is a trend of decreasing profit. How does it really matter in real, in real sense in capitalist economy? And can you just expand on this? What are the implications of it, and how true are these models of decreasing rate of profit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is volume 3, so you guys better get a move on to finish volume 2 so that you can consider the question of the law of the standard rate of profit fall. And Shadan, this is a big controversy amongst Marxist economists. If I was to get 100 Marxist economists, and I don't think there are that many in the world, but let's assume that there are, I would say that 70% of them consider the law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall to be irrelevant and rubbish and not relevant to understanding crises. Another 25% of them say profit is relevant, but not the law of profit. That leaves just me in a stagecoach with about 10 other Marxist economists. But I think Marx is in the stagecoach with me. So that's a big advantage to justifying this particular law. But it's a big controversy. So don't accept my word for it, because there's plenty of Marxist economists out there who consider this law as being irrelevant. What is its relevance? Well, its relevance is that if it's the case that there's a contradiction in capitalism, that as capitalists drive forward the machines and the robots and reduce the amount they spend on labor, that will lead, because labor is the only form, the only thing that creates value in a Marxist sense, that's the profit, the value, that is embodied in the price of commodities that are sold. If only labor creates that, only workers have to go to work to create labor. Otherwise, machines will sit still. We haven't reached the point yet where robots do everything. And so workers have to go to work to turn the machines on, to make sure they work, to keep them working. By the way, robots only last 11 years on average, a robot. So you need a lot more robots than human beings still. And they're getting them, but that's just to know that you actually are 7 times better than a robot. That process of increasing machinery leads eventually to a fall in the profitability, because the total cost you're spending on machinery is not reproduced in the total value of the workers being employed over time. So there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Now that doesn't produce a crisis on its own. What it does is it creates the conditions where capitalists are really on the edge, and particularly weaker ones perhaps are starting to lose money. Now, if there are other things happen, whether it's be a famine, an oil price boom, or all kinds of things which just should trigger something, I could think of in 2008 a housing price bubble in the United States, which kicked off a big downturn in the credit markets. And because profitability was so low, a lot of capitalist companies, starting with the banks and then the companies went to war, and you had a complete clap in profit. And when the mass of profit falls, not just the profitability, but the mass of profit falls, again, you can read all this in volume 3, then you're in a position of what Marx called absolute overaccumulation, a position where a slump is likely to take place. So the argument of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is empirically valid, not just me, but other Marxist economists have shown that over the long term there is a fall in the rate of profit, not in a straight line, not like a cliff, up and down in waves, but generally down over a period of time. So if you want it this way, it's increasingly more difficult for capitalism to get out of crisis because profitability now is 50% of where it was 70 years ago. So it needs even bigger slumps, and that's how you get out of a profitability crisis. You lay off a load of workers, you get rid of all that rubbishy machinery and replace it with decent robots eventually, and you wipe out all those zombie companies that aren't making any money and replace them with good, efficient companies which have a higher profitability, and then you can expand again. I'm arguing at the moment in my blog that they're not doing that. They've not done that. They've not cleansed the system of these crappy companies. They've not got rid of enough workers. They're keeping them on board because they're fearful of the consequences if they have such severe unemployment. So the economy is crawling. The world economy is crawling. It's stagnant. It's not progressing. Profitability stays low. And in that situation, there's every prospect eventually of a severe crash and slump, which would be necessary. So Marx, or Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, is an Austrian economist, called this creative destruction. His argument was that you get rid of all the old rubbish, and then the new exciting entrepreneurs like Jeff Bezos, one of these other guys who's so brilliantly clever, like Bill Gates, suddenly take the economy forward. So he believed in individual entrepreneurs would sort things out once we got rid of the trash. Marx quite likes the idea of creative destruction. In fact, Schumpeter took the idea from Marx that, yes, you destroy capital, create the conditions for those who are left to have a bigger profitability and grow. It's not entrepreneurs, it's just probably the bigger companies. In fact, it'll be Jeff Bezos who gains from the slump, not because he's an entrepreneur, but because he's so big. So that's the way in which we can see the process changing. At the moment, that is not happening. And so that is why I monitor the rate of profit all the time, best as I can, nationally and internationally, in order to judge the health of the capitalist economy and where it's going. And then, as I was telling Rome before, try to make predictions, a big mistake, in order to see where we're going with the world economy.
I think Michael's missed a point that he often mentions in his blog, is that you have these, the reason why, for example, in the West, you have quantitative easing, right? There's what these zombie companies, which barely sort of make enough to service their debt, but are kept alive by cheap credit. But anyway.
That's the situation at the moment. We'll see whether that changes.
Indeed. Aditya.
So my question is, like, in the reproduction schema, the investment in the department 2 is like there's a disbalance in the investment of these two departments. So at what time, at what, like, this consumerism comes into picture at what point in this disbalance?
Not quite sure I got that because you were breaking up a bit, Aditya. What you're saying is, what point does the consumer goods sector improve? Is that what you meant, or?
No. Like, at what point the consumerism comes into the picture?
Consumerism.
Like, we have seen this. Consumerism has been like increasing exponentially in past like 100 and 150 years or so. So at what point this comes into the picture? What accelerates it?
Shall I rephrase, see if I can understand that, because you were breaking up. At what point does consumerism come into the picture of capitalism? Is that what you said? Have I got that right? Does anybody else get it? Yeah, that's right, Rowan, is it? Well, I suppose what you're saying is that if the reproduction schema growth is in capital goods, there's not much consumerism going on, because we're just getting a lot of capital goods and heavy industry and so on to expand the economy and technology. But that doesn't mean to say that the consumer sector is not expanding as well. It does expand them. The schema is a artificial model with all kinds of assumptions that restrict its nature. But the main point being made, in the transition to growth, there will be a tendency to depress the consumer goods sector relative to the capital goods sector. But both over time and growth will expand. Clearly, as I showed in the United States, the consumer sector has been expanded in the last 100 years. Not as much as the capital goods sector, but it has expanded. And that expansion, of course, reflects the increase in the number of people that need to consume, and it also reflects a certain level of increase in consumption that's taking place. So in that sense, there is some consumerism. The point about capitalism and consumerism is that a lot of these consumption goods which capitalists are providing us are totally wasteful and useless. And they are designed to make workers buy over and over again things that they don't really need and are not designed to help improve their lives. I was just thinking, as I was watching the Eurozone Euro 2020 football at the moment, which Rowan is watching more than me, that before the match starts, halfway through the match, and at half time and afterwards, there are adverts. And the adverts, the main adverts, is gambling. It's telling young people to go and gamble on the football scores. So what more unproductive and degrading activity of consumerism can there be than gambling? And yet this is allowed, and all the footballers get orange, they go out there and gamble. And you think to yourself, well, what sort of a society is it that operates? And of course, why? Because gambling for many people seems to be the only way they'll ever get any decent money. And that's why they put some money on with 14 million to 1 chances of ever becoming rich out of it. And those wasteful forms of consumerism have expanded dramatically over the last 100 years and will continue to do so. Just finish on the point that the sort of consumer goods that we want under socialism are not those sort of goods. We want services that meet social need. And if everybody in the world had free health when they went to the hospital or the doctor, if everybody in the world had free education up to degree standard so that they can really educate themselves and develop, if everybody in the world had free broadband and full communication services and free transport, at least in the cities, everywhere in the world, wouldn't that be the sort of consumerism that would really take forward the world's population rather than gambling in Euro 2020?
Gamble responsibly, Michael. But next up is Prahlad.
Yeah. So basically, what the point of Rosa Luxemburg had come up. So I wanted to know that, basically her assumption is that there would be a fall of capitalism because of the constant unbalanced growth of constant capital. So, is her understanding of capitalism not materialist, or did she misinterpret Marx, or where did she actually go wrong with the whole process? That is the doubt I had.
Well, I think she was an imperialist. She was a great Marxist revolutionary. Her main object in writing her book on Imperialism, Accumulation, and Capital was to refute the position of the German Social Democrat leaders who are now using the reproduction schema, which we've been discussing, as proof that capitalism could go on accumulating and accumulating, and there will be no crisis. And if you look at the schema, you could see that they can balance, not just in simple reproduction, but also Marx shows in extended reproduction, and therefore capitalism works. And their view was it works forever. The schema proved that it works. Luxemburg, no way are we going to accept the argument that capitalism works and works forever. And the reason it doesn't work forever, Luxemburg concluded, was that Marx got it wrong. He didn't really take into account the imbalance which I've just described. And once you create an imbalance between capital goods and consumer goods, there's a chronic lack of demand, which can possibly be relieved by imperialism going to the third world and getting non-workers to buy capitalist goods. Although I've never quite understood Luxemburg's position to imagine that a poor peasant in the middle of China or India is actually going to save capitalism by buying a few goods from capitalists. But it was a theory that she was desperately looking for something to explain why imperialism and capitalism, both why capitalism is in trouble and why imperialism expanded. I think she was wrong in the way that she answered the question of the social democrat leaders. And when you get to volume 3, I think Marx gives you a better explanation of why imperialism developed and also why capitalism has regular crises. Actually, Luxemburg's theory implies that it's impermanent crisis, which is, as I've just argued, is not the case. And therefore, Luxemburg misinterpreted Marx's Capital in volume 2. And I think, just to finish, it's very important that you're reading volume 2. I have to point out that I think back in the late 19th century, all the top Marxists in their reading of Capital, like we're doing now, never read volume 3. Most of them hardly ever read volume 3, or they never really took it in. It wasn't available except in German, mostly. So the only, as Ryan was saying, maybe the only group that did were the Russians. But most leading Marxists in the activists in the movement, like yourselves, didn't read volume 3. They didn't know about volume 3. So the idea that there was a theory of crisis that was developed in volume 3 was not available to them. What they had was volume 1, which told them that capitalism was an exploitive system that screwed the workers for the benefit of capitalists. And that went down pretty well as an understanding of the nature of capitalism. And to some extent, volume 2, which says, well, you can interpret it. Social Democrats said it meant that capitalism could survive permanently. So the only reason we're opposed to capitalism was that it was exploitive and nasty, not because it had crises. Well, Luxemburg said, no, we are opposed to capitalism because it also has crises and it exploits the workers of the global south. So both sides were right and wrong, weren't they?
I think I'll go next. So I have two questions, Michael. So one thing that's been touched upon is this sort of is the fact that as you sort of elucidated, it seems pretty clear from the reproduction schema that Marx himself did imply that for long-term growth you need to have this disbalance, at least especially initially, between capital goods and consumer goods. But so, for example, at the same time, as you've also mentioned, like for example, the Soviet Union or with other implementations of reproduction schema, there still is some need to provide consumer goods. In fact, so we were reading the Penguin edition of Capital, and it's the introductions by Ernst Mandel, and he argues that, for example, this interpretation is wrong. So he says that, so for example, there was Maurice Dobb, who supposedly was one of the forefathers of this interpretation. There was the various first five-year plans adopted not just by Soviet countries but by and colonized countries after independence, such as India, with the Feldman model that gave this emphasis on capital goods. And even internally, there was this criticism that you didn't focus on consumer goods. So while obviously my own opinion firstly is that I think Ernst Mandel is wrong, there is some sort of, there's a fine balance to strike. And clearly that if I'm reading you correct, if I'm hearing you correctly, and so clearly that means that there would be some amount of essentially trial and testing before you sort of hit upon what would be an optimal goal, because ultimately if consumer goods are too low, then there is going to be unrest, there is going to be in fact even deprivation. So just firstly, if that makes sense. Secondly, another sort of criticism that I've read is that Marx had intended this in terms of use values. However, as other people built upon this, as for example, Vasily Leontief's input-output models, which are still used, I believe, in like national statistics, they use this schema for exchange values. And in fact, in planning everywhere, it has been used as for exchange values. So is this accurate? And what is the future of such planning? Is it something that you think will be successful, or is indeed needed? Sorry if that went on too long.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I know the answer, Ryan. I think this is an area I could learn from all you guys if you read this carefully. The interpretation of the schema is different. You have an interpretation, not only just what we've discussed before about whether there's an imbalance or not, but also, as you said, in the question of consumer goods, there is the issue of what the balance is between capital goods and consumer goods in a planning mechanism of a post-capitalist society. Under capitalism, they are making the decision on the basis of profits and the profitability of the sectors. So that doesn't appear. But when we're looking at the schema, as you say, the Soviet Union tried to use the schema, and Leontev and others, Soviet economists too, looking at trying to do the input-output tables, which is the mainstream version of a schema, if you like, taking the different use values existing in the economy and then seeing how they work out across the board, going into one sector and out of another sector and so on, so that we can you can judge whether they've got the right balance between these various use values. And I think the thing about the schema is it's showing about, it's starting from the point of view that beyond the exchange value, there is also the movement of use values, and that capital goods have different levels of size, of scale in their use values. They're different things. They're factories, they're not sofas. And that makes a difference to the way in which that the schema works out. So the input-output analysis is an important technical tool, I think, for planners in the future. It's not to be ignored. How it exactly pans out in terms of providing sufficient, the planning process to provide sufficient consumer goods relative to capital goods, so that people have enough food. We need to discuss it further. I mean, if we knew the answer to planning after the post-capitalist period in the world, because remember that the transition requires at least the G7 to be under our control. I'm afraid if India had a revolution next week, I'd still not be convinced that we were moving towards socialism, because India would still be surrounded by all those people down in Cornwall at the moment. And they certainly wouldn't be invited back to the next G7. So we have a major international crisis, which we already have really with China against the G7. Can China progress towards a proper plan which balances consumer goods and capital goods in that society, or is it already a capitalist economy? These are big debates that we need to understand, because out of that comes the question of how you deal with the planning mechanism, and whether the schema, which is very basic really, is relevant enough for us to consider as a model for the planning mechanism after capitalism. There's a lot of work being done now on what's usually called socialist calculation, the feasibility of planning. I went to the American Economics Association conference last time, and surprisingly, in the radical political sessions, there were a couple of people who have done work on planning using the latest computers and so on. I mean, you can go way, way better than input-output analysis now. And what do we mean by that? We mean that planners can say, this is what we ought to devote our resources to, but they're getting feed up from below, saying, in this community, we need this. In this community, we need that. We don't have these. How can we fit that into the plan? And you can use the quantum computers and all kinds of other things to really get a feedback on getting a plan which draws on the community, so that the plan feeds back into the needs of the community, and that we can get the balance right between, crudely in the consumer schema, just between capital goods and consumer goods, or perhaps more importantly, what sort of consumer goods, what sort of services and so on, and where they should be applied. Feasibility of socialist planning is definitely possible now. It's not, if it ever was not possible, it certainly is now.
Thank you for that. Rahul.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It's really, really helpful and fun. I had a small question about a particular term which is thrown around a lot, but I hope it has a specific meaning in this thought. And that term is the idea of a crisis. So if you could please expand on what does a crisis mean in this system of thought, and or when does a circumstance become a crisis? So that really was my question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an overused word, isn't it, crisis? I think I overuse it. And certainly, and the mainstream economists and journalists say everything's a crisis, isn't it? So it's not very helpful when everything's a crisis to know what a crisis is. In the terms of an economic crisis, or even more specifically, a crisis of capitalism, what I think we mean, and what Marx describes, is where basically capitalists produce a load of stuff and nobody's buying it, and the loads of workers are unemployed, and capitalists have produced too much they can't sell. That's the crisis. So the workers are under-consuming and the capitalists are overproducing. And this crisis means that millions of people are unemployed, and yet there's plenty of goods out there and things for them to have. It's just that they don't have the money to buy them, and the capitalists are not making any more profits, and they've closed their factories down, and they're not employing workers. How can that happen? And not just it happen once, but it happens on a regular and recurring basis. That's the point. If it just happened once in 100 years, or maybe we could say it was an asteroid hit factories or something. It was just a chance event out of our nature that happened. But no, since capitalism as a mode of production was formed, as Engels said very early on in the 1840s, then we can see that there are regular and recurring crises, as I've just described them, this sort of boom and slump process. And the slump is the crisis. Getting out of that slump, getting out of that crisis happens. And then a few years later, it seems about every 8 to 10 years, we get another slump of varying degrees of depth and length and severity. I mean, they're not all the same. Some are milder, some are deeper. The COVID slump, you could say, was nothing to do with capitalism. Well, that's a matter of debate, but it was very, very severe. But it seems relatively short, but very severe, the severest we've ever seen. The 2008 crisis or slump was the severest we've seen since the 1930s, where global production fell. Absolute global production fell, as it did in the COVID slump last year. So the world's economy didn't extend reproduction at all. It went backwards. So we had the reverse of extended reproduction in 2008-9. Now, it was down 3%. Well, 3%, what's that? Nothing. Well, if you think about 3%, that means millions of people out of work, millions of people forced into poverty. It means, and that 3% is the average. And that includes countries that were growing at 8 to 10%, like China or India, 6 or 7%, in that 3% down. So it was very, you can't measure it just on the level of average. And also you can't measure it on GDP. It's what about GDP per person, which is an even worse figure, where as population rises, that GDP falls, so the hit to people is even more severe. And what about the people at the bottom of the scale? The average doesn't tell you much about that. So these are severe crises. That's what a crisis is. That's the slump. That's the crisis. And what the Marxist economists are saying is that this is regular and recurring. So there must be a regular and recurring and underlying reason for this to keep happening. It can't just be chance and so on. Yes, every crisis is different. I've met lots of Marxist economists, and I have this debate all the time. If you read my blog and in my book, In Long Depression, it will tell you that every crisis is different. So there isn't any one law or theory that we can present for crises. All crises are different. The 1930s was a crisis of inequality. The 1970s was a crisis of profitability. The 2008 crisis was a crisis of property bubbles, credit bubbles, banking crash, and so on. But there isn't any underlying cause. So what you're a monocausal, that's what I'm usually called. You're a one cause man. You're looking for one cause, the Holy Grail, to explain capitalist crises. my reply to that is every crisis is different. Every crisis is triggered by a different thing. I wrote a paper which you can dig up somewhere. It's called Tulips, Triggers and Tendencies. Tulips, if you remember, was the first crisis, if you think of that, of collapse of prices and commodities in a market, when Dutch tulips that everybody had invested in 1620 disappeared down the drain. Maybe the tulips didn't, but the money did. And so that was the first crash. So you get the surface crash can be very different. It can be based on all kinds of triggers that can happen. The triggers can be different: oil, housing, stock market, famine, pandemics. All these can create a trigger. But what is the underlying process going on? And I don't think you can deny that there's an underlying cause here under capitalist crises that's regular and recurring. And that is the basis of our trying to look at below the surface to the theory, to the underlying causal processes going on in the laws of motion of capitalism, which explains crises. So crises is that's what it is how I describe it, and that's how it operates, I think, under capitalism.
So I think there are no other questions. So I think let's end on just one last question if Michael has the time. Let's end with something perhaps a bit more controversial. So Michael, from what I've gleaned from your blog, it seems to me that your view on China is that it is some form of socialist state, even though the law of value still operates there. There are, of course, various facets within that argument. For example, I think workers' democracy, workers' rights, and all that sort of stuff. There's increasing inequality as well, complemented by a huge sort of control of the state sector, especially in relation. If you look at state assets over GDP, it's incomparable, really. To most other countries in the world. But just to sort of draw it out a bit, what is the sort of your stand and position? Should you wish to answer that here? I know it's a bit of a
Well, it's a big question, and guys, it's very important that you discuss this at some point, the nature of the Chinese economy and state, because it's a big issue. And as we know, it's going to be the issue of the 21st century, the titanic struggle that's going to take place between the United States and its G7 acolytes in Cornwall, and China, the biggest populated country in the world, second in GDP, but still way, way down in productivity compared to the G7 economies. It is not an imperialist economy. It's not in a position to compete in world markets across the board, except up to now in low value-added products. Increasingly, it's trying to raise its technology. And this is what frightens US imperialism, because they see this as the future, as it were, gravedigger to their hegemony in the world. But leaving that aside, that's why it's so important to discuss. So is China just another capitalist state that's making its way, if you like Russia? In my view, Russia is clearly a capitalist state. Why is that? Why is Russia no longer like the Soviet Union? Let's go back further. Did the Soviet Union create a different sort of economy and state that existed before under Tsarist Russia and existed in all the other capitalist countries? What happened in the Soviet Union? There was a revolution which expropriated the capitalists and landowners. It was led by a party which was mainly based on a very small working class and aligned itself as best it could with the massive peasant class in Russia to expropriate the capitalists. By expropriating the capitalists and seizing the state power, then it was in the position to begin a process of trying to expand the extended reproduction schema, not through the process of profitability, but through the process of planning for social need as best it could. Now, in my view, that was very limited if Russia stayed on its own as an economy, presumably transitioning in some way towards socialism through a planning mechanism. What happened in Russia, of course, was that it didn't transition to socialism. It could not, for two reasons. One, in my view, socialism is a system without states, without money. It means the direct production for social need by common production and planning. It requires a world economy, a world government. But of course, we don't have revolutions simultaneously in every G7 country tomorrow to create the possibility of transitioning. You have to start somewhere. The Russian Bolsheviks had to start somewhere. They started in Russia. That's where they were. They, by chance, by luck, by war, for various reasons, they were able to gain control of the state, converted to some extent into what you might call a state aimed to benefit workers rather than the profitability of capitalists. But it was isolated, it was attacked, and it was unable to develop the technical resources. It could not on its own, and also increasingly within the leadership of the state and the party, there were forces that wished to return to the old order, and you had a battle, which in my opinion was eventually triumph for capitalism 70 years later, and the return, all the planning mechanism, all the state industries were privatized and sold off to Putin's mates, and you have a completely different operation. What is the situation in China? It's not, in my opinion, the same situation. But China also expropriated the landlords and capitalists in 1949. What was the Chinese Revolution? The Chinese Revolution was led by a party that said it was communist, but actually didn't base itself upon the working class, even like the Bolsheviks did. It based itself on the peasant who was driven into the countryside. The working class was annihilated by the landlords and capitalists by the war. And it had to base itself on the peasantry. It reached the cities. It was already not really a party which was interested in workers' democracy, on giving it was a party, a guerrilla army party based upon the peasantry. In fact, when workers tried to set up their own organizations in the city, such as the workers were in those cities, they were crushed by Mao's guerrilla army, who saw that as a threat to their process. But then the guerrilla army, the Maoists, were forced to expropriate the land lords and the capitalists. The capitalists fled to Taiwan, and China had to go in the direction of a planned economy. So we had decades of basically a planning mechanism, but of course the law of value still operated. Workers were still exploited for wages. Capitalists were still trying to introduce their control through foreign investment and so on, and trade, which was restricted under Mao's period. And then we go into a second period of the last 25 years in China, where the Chinese leadership decided they were not progressing sufficiently on the productivity of labor. They had to open up to foreign technology, and that meant foreign investment, and they had to open up the economy a bit more to the market, at least in the consumer areas outside of the big state sector. And as Dong famously said, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice. So that, by that, I take him to mean it doesn't matter whether it's the planning mechanism or the market, as long as it takes our economy forward. Well, in my view, you could say that over in a dialectical period for a period of time, but in the end, it does matter. That's in the end, it will matter whether it's a white mouse or white cat or a black cat. It will matter. Unless the planning mechanism triumphs and the law of value is defeated, China will not be able to continue this process of supposedly moving towards a socialist economy. Finished on this, Ryan, it's a big subject. We need to go around 2 points. First of all, China is not a socialist society, in my view. Socialism is only possible when I've described it. Is it transitioning to socialism? Well, I think it's in a position where it's trapped, where the planning mechanism, the state sector, and the party bureaucracy leaning on that continue to operate in the direction of trying to restrict the law of value and maintain the state sector in the interests of some social needs for the working people. But it's not under the pressure of the working class. It doesn't allow workers' democracy in any way. Therefore, it's got feet of clay. It can collapse under the pressure of capitalism and the law of value. And the law of value is strong in China. We have billionaires, we have inequality, we have big market economy. We even have more and more flows of foreign investment coming in now, not in investment for improving technology, but in finance and all kinds of other speculative areas, which the Chinese bureaucracy, or at least a section of them, is allowing. So it's trapped between these two forces. It's not going in the direction of socialism, but it's not returned to capitalism. When I say that, it's neither capitalist nor socialist. A lot of people say, well, that's bonkers. It must be one or the other. But that's not thinking about things dialectically, is it? Things are not black and white immediately. There's a process of change going on. This is, I used to call it a weird beast. China's a weird beast. It's neither the black cat nor the white cat. It's moving. Which direction it will go remains to be seen. I would say, I can predict, if there is not a further expansion of the revolutions into other countries, in important countries, led by working class movements, then over the next few decades, despite China's fantastic progress, I think it's under threat of returning to capitalism. That will be if you ask me to make a bet, Euro 2020, then China, by the end of this century, could be capitalist if nothing else changes. But I think that other things could change. We could see changes in the global north and in other parts of the global south, which will alter the picture, give support for the forces, if you like, for socialism in China that still exist. That's my answer. It's a weird beast. It's not black and white. It's not capitalist. It's not socialist. For that, I get all kinds of rubbish. I am attacked viciously from both sides. So I'll leave you. I don't know what Communist Party Marxist says, but I'm not up to date.
I think if I correct me if I'm wrong, guys. I think the party's stance is that it is some sort of transition towards a socialist state, given that it's the communist parties in power.
It is in line with Deng's.
In Deng's view, is it?
Yes.
It's socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah. That's exactly.
Which, of course, is the bureaucracy's way. First of all, I don't think it's socialist. It's certainly got Chinese characteristics. But in a way, you could say, well, that's not such a bad term, because it tells you it's not capitalist. So in that sense, I like it. On the other hand, I don't like it because it implies that socialism looks like what China is now. No, thank you. I think socialism is a much more wonderful thing that we could talk about that we haven't got anywhere near yet. Now, the reply of other people is, yes, we know it's not socialist, but it's going there. It's on the way to socialism. All I would say is that there's a lot of forces in China and outside China that will make that difficult, and it can't be achieved on their own. It cannot be achieved on their own. I do not like the idea of socialism in one country, even if it's got Chinese characteristics.
Just so we actually had one discussion on this when we discussed the revolutions, and it was, I think, our most contentious debate. But no, thank you so much, Mike.
Sorry to interrupt. I just say that 90% of Marxists say that China is capitalist. So let's be clear about that. This view that I've expressed is a tiny minority. The vast majority of Marxist economists, everyone I read, including my close colleagues who I consider a very good Marxist economist, consider China as capitalist because the law of value operates. There's inequality. Workers are exploited. There's no democracy. Those are the arguments that they present. Then you have a version of that of state capitalism that China was never had expropriated capitalism. It started from the beginning as capitalist, but the capitalist is the state, not the capitalist. That's another theory, which is pretty bonkers.
I think in South Asian communist parties, that trend is like sort of not very dominant. We generally are like more sympathetic to the Chinese cause.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt again. It's a very contentious issue. You need to discuss it over and over again.
I personally think that, China is actually, it is a feudalistic system. Like, politically it is feudalism, but at the same time you have these elements of socialism with it. So it's a very mixed kind of politically, socio-politically and economically, it's a very mixed kind of a place, like not falling in any particular, not fitting definitions of one particular area, like either be democracy plus socialism. No, it's not that. At the same time, it is not like feudalism, dictatorship, capitalistic. It's not clearly falling in the right or left as it is.
It's neither black nor white, is it? That's the issue. If
Yeah.
we're using Donald's cat. I have to say another point, that I always say to people, say, oh, well, China's capitalist. Okay, so if China's capitalist, this is the most successful capitalist economy in the world in the last 70 years. How do we explain that China has been growing at 8 to 10% a year? It has dramatically taken 850 million Chinese out of the World Bank's definition of poverty. You telling me that capitalism is fantastically successful after all, and that we've been all wrong all this time about capitalism being in crisis and not being able to solve the productive forces because China has proved that capitalism works. And my second point is to, and what about India? India is supposed to be the example of capitalist success because it clearly is capitalist. Has it really done as well as China? Has it really changed the position for the masses in India? Is the poverty rate really down in India compared to China? No way. So what is different about China? It's either, if it's capitalist, then I think we better mock up Marxist economics and start again.
I think so. I think we should. It's almost 9:30 here, so I think we should call it a day. But just to sort of, I think from I speak for everyone else when I say thank you so much, Michael. This was thoroughly helpful and enlightening. And hopefully we can collaborate again in the future if time and events permit. But yeah, just thank you once again, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Yeah, and thank you everyone. The questions were great, and it made me. I'm going to have to go and read some stuff now. And thanks very much for your questions.
Glad we could sort of stimulate your intellect as well. So also, I think we will have a recording. So in case you would like that, I think we can send that over afterwards. Just
that'd be good. Yeah.
We will send that across. But yeah,
I'll edit you all out and just leave myself on.
Sure. No. I'm sure you won't. No, I think I said that because I think you upload a lot of your talks on YouTube, which is why I think in my
exactly, that'd be good. Yeah. Thanks very much for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. Hopefully we see you soon.
Great session, sir. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
That was an interesting session, I think.